Since October 7, 2023, the United States has sent a huge amount of military and financial support to Israel. At the very same time, we've seen international organizations document some really serious allegations of violations of international law. All of this has sparked a tough and very complex legal question. Could the U.S. actually be held legally responsible for its role in the conflict? Let's unpack that argument.
And this, right here, is the question at the heart of this entire debate. It's not about whether U.S. soldiers were on the ground, not at all. It's about whether providing the tools for a conflict can cross a line into legal responsibility. That's the core of the legal challenge we're about to explore.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. First up, we'll look at the actual rules of law that govern this stuff. Then, we're going to dive into the two key parts of the legal claim, the act of U.S. assistance and the knowledge behind it. And finally, we'll look at the official U.S. position on all of this.
All right, so before we can even get into the facts, we have to understand the rules of the game. This isn't about anyone's opinion, it's about a specific legal framework that exists under international law to govern how countries are supposed to act, especially during wartime.
Okay, so under what's called international humanitarian law, or IHL, there are very clear rules for armed conflict. When those rules are broken in a really serious way, they're considered war crimes. In this specific conflict, international groups have raised alarms about things like intentionally attacking civilians, using starvation as a weapon, and forcing people from their homes. For any claim of complicity to even get off the ground, it has to be linked to an alleged wrongful act like one of these.
So what does it actually mean for another country to be complicit? Well, the legal term is aiding and abetting, and it's not about directly taking part in the act itself. Nope, it's about knowingly enabling it, providing significant help to another country when you are aware that help is going to be used to commit a wrongful act.
Any legal claim of complicity pretty much rests on two distinct pillars. You can think of it as the act and the mind. First, you've got the actus reus, that's the physical act of providing significant help. And second, you have the mens rea, that's the mental part, having the knowledge that your help is contributing to those wrongful acts. You have to prove both. So let's look at the argument for each one, starting with the act.
So, that first pillar, the actus reus, the physical act. The argument here really centers on one key idea, that the material support from the U.S. was so significant, so substantial, that it had a direct effect on Israel's ability to conduct its military operations.
And you know, the numbers themselves tell a pretty big story. According to an analysis from Brown University, U.S. spending to support Israel's military campaign in just the year after the conflict began totaled at least $22.76 billion. That's a massive acceleration of what was already a long-standing policy of support.
But the argument goes way beyond just the dollar amount. It's about the type of aid being provided. Legal analyses point to specific offensive weapons, like thousands of these huge Mk-84 2,000-pound bombs. Military experts worry about them because they have such a wide blast radius, especially in dense urban areas. The list also includes things like 155mm artillery shells, which are often criticized as being inherently indiscriminate in populated zones, and JDAM kits, which groups like Amnesty International have documented at the sites of deadly strikes on civilian homes.
And the idea of assistance here is broader than just weapons. The legal argument also points to other kinds of support. Things like diplomatic shielding at the UN Security Council, where U.S. vetoes have blocked ceasefire resolutions. It also reportedly includes sharing intelligence for targeting and actively working against investigations by bodies like the International Criminal Court.
Okay, so that covers the argument for the physical act of assistance. But remember, that's only half of the legal test. Now we have to turn to that second and maybe more complex pillar, the mens rea, or the mental element. The big question is, did the U.S. government know its assistance could be contributing to these alleged wrongful acts?
You know, the argument for U.S. knowledge often kicks off with public statements from its own leaders. As early as December 2023, President Biden himself publicly warned that Israel was losing support because of its indiscriminate bombing. This wasn't some private memo. This was a direct public acknowledgement of the nature of the campaign.
A really key part of the argument for knowledge comes from just looking at the timeline. In December, you've got that public warning from the president. In January, the world's highest court, the ICJ, finds a plausible risk of genocide. Then in May, the U.S. State Department's own report says it was reasonable to assess that U.S. weapons were used in violation of international law. Those making the complicity claim argue that despite all this mounting knowledge, major arms sales kept going through.
And this quote, this is a critical piece of evidence in the argument. This isn't from the UN or a human rights group. This is from an official U.S. State Department report to Congress. It's a formal acknowledgement that the executive branch had credible information suggesting its own weapons had likely been used in violation of international law.
So far, we've unpacked the legal argument for complicity, pillar by pillar. But to be thorough, we have to look at the other side of the coin. How does the United States government officially respond to all these claims? What are its legal and political defenses?
The entire dispute can really be broken down into these core points. On one hand, the complicity claim argues the U.S. knowingly provided the means for alleged crimes. But the official U.S. defense counters that no, the purpose of the aid was legitimate self-defense. The claim says that knowledge of likely misuse is the legal standard. The defense, on the other hand, argues that the U.S. lacks specific intent to facilitate crimes and doesn't have operational control over the Israeli military. And finally, while some point to the universal jurisdiction of international courts, the U.S. flatly rejects the authority of bodies like the ICC over itself or its allies who aren't members.
Ultimately, when you zoom out, this debate goes far beyond just this one conflict. It really represents a fundamental challenge to the entire system of international law. It pits the obligations that countries have under that law against the foreign policy goals of a global superpower and its powerful alliances.
And all of this leaves us with a profound and, frankly, unresolved question. In a world of complex alliances and conflicts, when does providing support and weapons to an ally cross the line from just being a partner into being legally responsible for how those weapons are used? The answer to that question is going to define the future of international law.